Welcome to Women in Science Fiction, 1666 to 1969. I created this brief section for this class to talk about women's involvement in the history of science fiction. And originally I didn't have this separated for anything, it was just in the class, but when Ursula K. Le Guin died, she was an author of The Dispossessed, Left Hand of Darkness, many notable science fiction and fantasy works. I saw a lot of articles, tweets, Facebook posts, general social media asking who the next Le Guin would be and asking women to raise their hand or sound off if they are involved in science fiction. And I thought both of those questions were really problematic. Asking who was going to fill Le Guin's shoes implied that there was only one pair of shoes and that it needed to be filled, when we have amazing, powerful, and strong feminine voices in science fiction right now, like Nnedi Okorafor, N.K. Jemisin, Anne Leckie, and so many more. And asking women to sound off if they're involved in the science fiction community was problematic because there's never been a time when women weren't involved. Since science fiction was created, there has not been a decade where women were not writing, reading, broadcasting, promoting, and consuming science fiction. And so this short section is just to really address that and kind of let you know and see how much women have been involved in creating what we now consider science fiction, speculative fiction, and fantasy. And you're going to see them come up again in the rest of the class when we talk about innovations in technology and how it relates to science fiction. But I wanted to kind of establish now that these voices have always been a part of the history of the genre. Let's begin. In 1666, Margaret Cavendish writes and publishes The Blazing World. It examines the intersection of race and gender, science, imagination, and what it means to identify self. It is referenced in China Miéville's Unladun and Alan Moore's Watchmen. And for those works that are in the public domain, which means their copyright has expired, I will include the Gutenberg or archive.org links at the bottom so that you can check them out if you choose to. Now, Margaret Cavendish and Aphra Behn, who was a poet, were largely considered proto-science fiction. With Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is the name that her work's generally known by now, so that's what we'll use in this class, she's largely credited with creating modern science fiction. She also published The Last Man, which is also heavily science fiction. It's kind of her wheelhouse, honestly, creating this new genre that we'll be studying in this class. In 1827, Jane Webb Ludham published The Mummy. Her work is particularly fascinating because she created this cultural and technological shift because she placed her story in 2120. She also popularized gardening as a healthy activity for young ladies, and I just think that's interesting because she had such disparate interests. Gertrude Barrows Bennett, in 1907, published her first work at the age of 17. I love her picture because she just looks like she knows she's going to creep you out. She just has this kind of evil smirk, and I love it. She wrote under the pen name of Frances Stevens and basically created dark fantasy. H.P. Lovecraft, who was the writer of Call of Cthulhu and a lot of those horror fantasy tales, praised her works, thought she was incredibly imaginative. She also wrote a number of sci-fi stories, and the one that she's most well known for there is The Citadel of Fear. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In 1915, Charlotte published Herland. Herland imagines a world populated by women who reproduced asexually. It takes a hard look at how gender roles are socially constructed, and it's actually part of a trilogy, which is not something most people are aware of. You probably recognize the name from reading The Yellow Wallpaper, which is required reading in a lot of high schools. In 1926, Charlotte Haldane published Man's World. It looked a lot at the same kind of ideas as Herland regarding gender roles. Specifically, her story followed a world that was ruled by a small group of elite male scientists. Women who didn't adhere to traditional gender roles are punished and sterilized. Actually, a lot of the traits and characteristics of her book can be found in Bitch Planet, which is written by Kelly Sue DeConnick and is an ongoing Image Comics graphic novel right now. Check it out, it's really great. Claire Winger Harris, in 1926, became the first woman to publish stories under her own name in sci-fi magazines. Her works pushed the definition of what it meant to be a human being. She wrote a lot about cyborgs and among other human variants, and really asked what makes a human human. People were amazed that a woman could write such amazing science fiction, which is kind of funny because 92 years later, I still hear people kind of say the same thing about other female authors. Metropolis. Whether or not you've seen the movie, you're probably familiar with the imagery that comes from it. It was released in 1927 by Fritz Lang. However, it was his wife, Thea von Harbo, who wrote the book and the play. Kay Burdekin, aka Murray Constantine. In 1929, Kay Burdekin published The Rebel Passion. She did that under her own name, but afterwards continued writing under the pen name Murray Constantine. She was strongly anti-fascist and highly political in her speculative fiction, and she used the pen name to keep her female lover and her family safe. Swastika Night was actually published a decade before Orwell's 1984 and largely dealt with the same themes: erasure of the past, disinformation campaign, totalitarian regimes. She was an ardent pacifist who later left the movement believing that fascism must be fought tooth and nail. 1932. C. L. Moore, also known as Catherine Lucille Moore, published her first works and serials of the day like Weird Tales. She'd grown up reading fantasy and science fiction. She was nominated to be the first woman Grandmaster of the SFWA, which is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. However, at the time, her family requested that the offer be withdrawn due to her advanced Alzheimer's. Margaret Brundage. 1933 to 1938, Margaret Brundage was the most frequently appearing cover artist for Weird Tales magazine. She signed her name M. Brundage to hide the fact that she was a woman because conservative groups often complained about the damsel's risque nature in her works. Her work for the magazine supported her family while her husband contributed little, except for drinking and gambling debts. When Weird Tales switched its headquarters to Chicago, Margaret lost her job and passed away in poverty decades later. These are a few of her infamous covers. I particularly like the one in the middle because Red Nails by Robert E. Howard was actually a Conan the Barbarian tale, and you can see C.L. Moore's name on both the green cover and the blue cover to the right. Vita Sackville West was famously a lover of Virginia Woolf, and there are actually entire books on her sexual conquests, but we're going to cover her briefly because in 1942 she wrote The Grand Canyon. It's the only science fiction that she wrote, but it's an amazing alternative history. It cursed the policy of appeasement and questioned the newfound technologies that war brings and their impact on society and culture. In 1947, Alice Mary Norton, also published under Andrew North and Andrew Norton, releases her first work, The People of the Crater, in Fantasy Book Magazine. I read her books for years, not realizing she was a woman. She was one of the founding members of Swordsmen and Sorcerers Guild of America and was the first woman to be an SFWA Grand Master and the first woman inducted into the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. Wilmar Shiras. In 1948, Wilmar H. Shiras, pen name Jane Howes, wrote and published In Hiding about a group of super gifted children trying to find their place in the world. It basically went viral for the day and was added to many anthologies. It is included in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. It has been credited, though this is not confirmed, to be the inspiration for the Uncanny X-Men. In 1949, Miriam Allen DeFord begins writing the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Her stories are a beautiful blend of science fiction and mystery, and her bibliography is honestly about as long as my arm. In 1950, Mildred McElroy Klingerman published a number of short stories and anthologies. Anthony Boucher dedicated a book to her for her influence on the genre. And what I really like about her is that she also published in Good Housekeeping and Collier's. You're never either or. It's not less feminine to be interested and involved in science fiction. You can be more than one thing. What's really great is after I published an article on this, her family got in touch with me and let me know that they have actually started re-releasing her works. So hopefully we'll be able to find them again shortly. In 1952, Betty Ballantine, later Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame inductee, established Ballantine Books with her husband. They would become one of the leading publishers in science fiction. 1955, Leigh Brackett publishes The Long Tomorrow. She first had her works published in Astounding Science Fiction magazine in the 1940s, and she is known as the Queen of Space Opera. She also wrote a little movie called The Empire Strikes Back, and she was the first woman shortlisted for a Hugo Award. Zena Henderson. Senna had actually grown up reading science fiction. She loved it. She would collect weird tales, astounding stories, and all the popular publications at the time. So, she published her first work in 1961, but she'd been reading science fiction since she was 12. This isn't a time when people really, even more so than now, didn't think women were reading science fiction. She published a collection of short stories called Pilgrimage, the Book of the People. In 1950, she was considered to be a very up-and-coming author, and she continued publishing for decades. In 1965, Cecil Goldsmith Lally steps down as editor of Amazing Stories. During her time as editor, she encouraged many new writers and readers, many of them female. Ursula K. Le Guin credited Goldsmith as opening the door to her. Anne McCaffrey, in 1967, published Dragonflight. On a personal note, Dragon Song was one of the first books that I remember reading. She was the first woman to win a Hugo Award for fiction and the first to win a Nebula Award. When she published White Dragon, the story of Jackson and Ruth the White Dragon, it was one of the first science fiction books to be placed on the New York Times bestseller list. And that brings us to 1969. Ursula K. Le Guin publishes The Left Hand of Darkness. She continues a proud and long tradition of women involved in science and speculative fiction. And we will miss her. But we will also continue that same long and proud tradition in our next part, 1970 to 2017. I hope you check back in. Thanks for listening.